In the beginning, I said superheroes are a Rorschach test, because 3 people can look at the same character and have fundamentally different interpretations.
Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Spider-Man was designed to subvert the expectations of the original, traditional superhero stereotype. In his introductory paragraph in Amazing Fantasy number 15, Stan Lee said, "Confidently, we in the comic mag business refer to them as long underwear characters. And as you know, they're a dime a dozen, but we think you may find our Spider-Man just a bit different." Stan Lee impression is awful. Therefore, the purpose of this essay is to analyze Spider-Man's original appearance to discover the main narrative values and patterns that define him, then use the results to compare and contrast the 3 live-action adaptations to fully understand the bloody Rorschach quality that I keep going on about. And I don't know, I just keep making this stuff up.
Human spider.
A human spider, that's it? That's the best you got?
Yeah.
Amazing Fantasy number 15 was released back in 1962. Not including the ads, the story is comprised of 13 pages, and the 3-act structure is framed in a cyclical way. 3 pages are devoted to Peter Parker being bullied by a culture of apathy and mockery, from other teenagers, scientists at the exhibit, and even a driver that almost bloody hits him. Then 5 pages are used to show Spider-Man misusing his powers by only caring about fame, money, and more importantly, treating other people lesser than him. Subsequently, unlike Sam Raimi or Mark Webb's adaptation, Uncle Ben's killer does not successfully escape because Peter Parker was trying to get back at someone.
You could have taken that guy apart.
2 cents.
You can't afford your milk. Just step aside.
Now he's going to get away with my money.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
But because he's simply apathetic. Oddly enough, like the John Watts interpretation, Spider-Man has a self-image problem where he overthinks who he is because the world keeps showing him powerful personalities that simply isn't him.
I could work really hard and he would,
For example, there's a moment where Peter Parker explicitly declares, "I'm through being pushed around by anyone. From now on, I just look out for number 1. That's me." And then when he's with his aunt and uncle, he says, "They're the only ones who've ever been kind to me. I'll see to it they're always happy, but the rest of the world can go hang for all I care." Spider-Man's selfishness and self-indulgence before the death of his uncle is a product of the culture and social values around him. Furthermore, the final 3 pages are used to show Spider-Man hoisted by his own petard, because the only person that suffers from his apathy isn't the bullies or the world that rejected him, but one of the only people that didn't. However, Uncle Ben doesn't die from a heroic death. He doesn't try talking the criminal down or rugby tackling a gunman. It entirely happens off-screen. There's a tendency to glamorize and fetishize Uncle Ben as a messianic figure that tightly grips Spider-Man's origin, but in his original appearance, he's actually merely, and surprisingly, just a cog in a bigger narrative machine, as opposed to being the machine itself, because he only appears in 5 panels, with only 1 devoted to him. Uncle Ben's famous mantra, "with great power comes great responsibility," is not said by him. Instead, it's actually a non-diegetic closing narration box summarizing the lesson of the story. And it doesn't just include Spider-Man's experiences, but the story with everyone in it. Its original opening is, "Aware at last that in this world, with great power, there must always come great responsibility." Consequently, the overall story is centered on the theme of change, but not just with Peter Parker, but the wider landscape, for the reason that the cycle of apathy and abuse is now broken by Spider-Man's mission as a superhero. One act of kindness can change everything. Uncle Ben's life is worth the same as any other person, and any other person, even if they're a bully, is worth just as much as Uncle Ben. That's the lesson. Alright, to conduct the comparison, Irving Goffman's dramaturgical theory is going to be used to isolate some of the different narrative ingredients that are relied upon in Amazing Fantasy number 15's themes, and to also produce a research frame that's relevant for all 3 adaptations.
That's the problem. He doesn't know what to think.
Gonna make you mad not to know who you are. Your soul disappears.
I've gone on about Irving Goffman's identity theories a good couple of times now, but Suffice to say, he argued that human identity exists as an unconscious performance because what we wear, who we're with, and where we are changes how we manage our impressions. For example, we act differently at a doctor's appointment than we do at a job or with our friends. Therefore, Goffman argued that outward interactions forms who we are just as much as who we are inside. Subsequently, Goffman marked out 6 key components that directly shape the way we construct ourselves. However, to avoid overstretching this analysis, this research will only use a couple, and also the comic is only 13 pages, so not every factor is going to be relevant, and I'm going to sound even more pretentious than usual.
You mother Hubbard, are you serious?
The first element is the performance, which is how the masks are worn. Is it an honest expression of the self, or is it an exhibition used to deal with other people's needs?
Thank you, Miss Parker, for having me. And thank you guys for having me.
Spider-Man, in quotation marks, as a performance in the comic was created with the intent to protect Peter Parker from embarrassment if he was to lose the fight with Crusher Hogan. However, it then evolves into his brand identity, and by the end it becomes his superhero persona. The evolution of Spider-Man, again in quotation marks, stems from how the mask liberates him and allows him to truly reach his potential. For example, Peter Parker builds the web shooters and the beautiful costume because he's inspired by his freedom. He argues, "So they laugh at me for being a bookworm, eh? Well, only a science major could have created a device like this." Therefore, despite Peter Parker's normal quality, he's also supposed to be already a remarkable and gifted individual because he's on his way to getting a scholarship. He gains his powers because he's the only smart person in a world full of dummies. As Flash said, "You stick to your science, son, we'll stick to the chicks," when asked if he wanted to go to the science exhibit too. Peter Parker even forgets the mockery because he's enamored with the experiment. As a result, Spider-Man as a performance is also very much a manifestation of both Peter Parker's ambition and his guilt. Often a lot of writers tend to forget this because they're so nostalgic for Spider-Man being this miserable old poop, but, you know, there we go. Subsequently, both Mark Webb and John Watts' interpretation adheres to this original logic. They're both science-savvy individuals that build their own web shooters and are headed towards very bright futures in big companies. However, what differs between them is what the costume means for their performances. Webb's interpretation, like the comic, functions not only as an act of responsibility but as an outlet for his creativity too, because a montage is devoted to him falling in love with the journey of being inventive and artistic and forgetting his cynical mission for vengeance.
Yeah. Eggs? Organic, got it.
Whereas the Watts iteration complicates this with 2 different costumes, the original homemade suit and the Stark suit. Therefore, a symbolic distinction is drawn between his cynical performance as a kid inauthentically acting like his idol,
I just wanted to be like you. And I wanted you to be better.
and as a boy truly becoming a man by accepting who he is honestly. But regardless, like the Webb iteration, Peter ends up in the same place. Spider-Man is who he is deep down inside, and it's honest. However, Sam Raimi has the most thematically divergent interpretation. It preserves the wrestler origins behind the costume, but then removes the web shooters, downplays Peter's gift and passion as a scientist.
Now what?
And doesn't involve the creation of the nicer Spider-Man costume into his creative personality. Instead, it's simply treated as the movie hitting an unspoken theatrical expectation.
Right up in the crotch a little bit, too.
As a result, this is deliberately designed to narratively strip away Peter Parker's ambition, future, agency, and draw a line between Spider-Man and Peter Parker, because in this interpretation, he has no control over the Spider-Man persona to the extent that the sequel goes as far as making him powerless to his own body. And if it was up to him, he'd rather not do it at all. Therefore, the new narrative pattern reverses the comic's original themes, because Spider-Man doesn't emotionally emancipate Peter Parker, but completely oppresses him. It's different, but I suppose it's poignant in its own way. The second part are the teams, which are the friendships and fellow actors that reinforce how their identities are performed. In Amazing Fantasy number 15, Peter's company is entirely comprised of his aunt, uncle, and the popular kids at school that reject him. No one else is prominent enough to impact Spider-Man's arc, or provide him a particular membership to something. As a result, these two groups are thematically designed to give Peter Parker a choice: either grow up to be kind like his surrogate parents, or become a bully like everyone else. Furthermore, all three initial adaptations has an ending that features their own version of this ultimatum. It's very weird. In Spider-Man Homecoming, Peter Parker can literally either accept his membership with the Avengers or keep his membership with his friends.
But I'd rather just stay on the ground.
Then in Amazing Spider-Man 1, Peter Parker must choose to either forsake his newfound connection with the social world or break his promise and be with Gwen.
But those are the best kind.
And finally, in Sam Raimi's interpretation, Peter can either altruistically follow his uncle's word or be selfish and accept Mary Jane's love. They all broadly subscribe to the notion that Spider-Man comes at the cost of want. Amazing Spider-Man 1 is a lot looser with this because the want comes from his impulse to go back to his old isolated self, as opposed to wanting the girl like the Raimi version, but it still follows the message of fighting against the easy answer is ironically the right answer.
I'm just no good for her.
Peter Parker, if there's one thing you are, it's good.
Although all three endings are also followed by sequels that deliberately contradict Peter Parker's decision, Far From Home positions Spider-Man not only as an Avenger, but as the only Avenger left.
I'm just a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, sir.
Bitch, please, you've been to space.
In Amazing Spider-Man 2, Peter Parker's choice results in the death of Gwen Stacy, and in Spider-Man 2, Peter Parker ends up with Mary Jane anyway, because the choice never mattered. It was her decision, not his.
Can't you respect me enough to let me make my own decision?
As a result, these sequels also recontextualize who Spider-Man is, who he belongs to, and are designed to allow the director's own interpretation to blossom and actually overshadow the comic's original themes. Mark Webb's version planted a seed at the very opening shot with a young Peter Parker being left behind as a child. So contradicting his decision is Webb declaring that this Spider-Man is destined to be alone forever with no teams. Watt's version opened with him looking up to the Avengers, therefore not only does he belong with them, but it's baked into his artistic DNA that he'll eventually grow up and surpass them. And the thematic anchor that holds Sam Raimi's version together is that Peter Parker doesn't grow up. Mary Jane was the person Peter Parker wanted to be with before his powers, before he was a teenager, and is the very first thing we're introduced to as an audience. In this interpretation, Spider-Man is a little boy forever. He belongs with his childish dreams, as awful and as beautiful it may be. As a result, all three interpretations twist the narrative purpose of Peter Parker's teams to reframe it into their own interested thematic areas. In other words, they break the pattern to forge new ones. Change is inevitable, especially with growing up. You don't just grow hairier nipples, but crossing the threshold between boyhood and adulthood is often a deeply personal, unflattering, and reflective process. The story of the original Amazing Fantasy number 15 is more or less a document of this epoch. Spider-Man is created because a boy was forced to review his own life in order to realize what his purpose is. Webb put a highlighter to the loneliness of this process. Watts focused on how idols can obscure your ability to understand yourself, and Raimi concentrated on the painful nostalgia that comes from difficult transitions. Don't worry, I'm not going to reread Wilson Coe's essay about nostalgia. However, Peter Parker's arc is actually very consistent with it. Therefore, at the heart of Spider-Man's Rorschach-like status is a very specific sort of freedom, where every reader and every storyteller can project their own individual experiences into it, because Spider-Man's story is one about ambition, it's about guilt, being controlled by trauma as much as overcoming it, and the realization that self-knowledge is just as important as any other superpower. And yeah, I feel like I said kind of the obvious thing here, but I wish I had a better closing statement. Oh yeah, my favorite live-action Spider-Man is...
One of the very few comic book characters, even back then, that was covered from head to toe. Like, if Captain America, you still have this much of his face. Spider-Man's completely enveloped in his costume.
Oh, you know the good thing about that?
Yes.
You could be any kid.
Yeah.
You could be black. You could be Asian. You could be Indian. You could be anything, and imagine you were in that costume. So I think that made it relevant to everybody everywhere.
What do you take me for? Some kind of pervert? Yes, I looked her up once. Twice.